I'm Darren Morton.
I'm Simon Matthews. This is Lift,
The Lifestyle Medicine podcast, where we dive into the science of health and wellbeing. Well, welcome, Simon. It's good to see your face again. Tell me, brother, whereabouts have you been?
Likewise, Darren. Great to see you. I have been to London to visit the Queen. No, I haven't. Haven't been there at all.
I thought you had a special invitation there.
And I would be going to London to visit the King anyway. But no, I haven't been there.
Truth.
But I have been to Orlando, Florida, and not to Disney World. I just got back from the 20th anniversary conference of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine.
Beautiful thing. I'm envious, I've got to say. I had to put family first this year. Actually, just before we started recording this, I had my son call up and say, Dad, I just finished my final exam ever at high school. So his graduation's on. So there's a lot happening in the Morton household at the moment. But tell me, what did I miss?
I'm going to say probably primarily you missed a lot of energy. That was the thing that really stood out to me this year. I mean, it's always an energizing and energized conference, but this year in particular, because it was the 20th anniversary conference, because the college has grown significantly. So there are now 13,500 college members. I believe, I haven't been able to independently verify this, but I have heard, and I believe that the American College of Lifestyle Medicine is now the fastest growing medical association in the United States.
And so it should be.
If that is true, then that's wonderful news for lifestyle medicine and the future health of people on the planet.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually was chatting with someone who was there just this morning, and they said that a large proportion were first timers as well. And
exactly,
I
right.
love that.
Yeah.
I love that energy that comes out. And I love meeting, bumping into people, and they say, I didn't even know this existed, but I just found my tribe. And that's I love that. I love that energy.
Yeah. It was also one of the really lovely parts of this conference was that every past president, in addition to the current president and the president-elect, were all present. Every one of them was there, and in fact, there was a panel discussion between them all. So it was lovely to see that, that sort of chain of history across the years of the college. Yeah, great experience.
Beautiful. I certainly won't miss it next year. But I do have very fond memories of last year, and this is the topic I'd love to explore with you today. Because last year we were in Colorado, and unlike Florida, it was cold. I remember it was actually...
It was snowing.
It was snowing. We did our fun out there. They have their 5-kilometer fun run one of the mornings, and I remember it was negative something, and that was Celsius.
Yeah.
So it was really chilly. But I had the good fortune. I had 3 of my friends, my mates from Australia. They said, if you're going to Colorado, let's meet you there after the conference finishes, and let's do a road trip back to California, and we'll go trail running, because I enjoy that sort of stuff. So we did, and we went to the Rockies in Colorado there. And I remember we did one trail run up the hill, and it's high altitude. And I think that I'm very susceptible to altitude for some reason. I know that whenever I even go skiing, I often get a headache, and I feel really dry in the mouth and all the rest of it. And I remember we were jogging along, and we were jogging slow because that's all you can do. And I said to one of them, literally the ground was swimming backwards and forwards for me. And I'm like, this doesn't seem right. And I said to one of my mates, I said, hey, are you sort of seeing strange things? And they're like, nah, it doesn't feel any different to me at all. And I'm thinking, I don't know, maybe it's just me. But what it made me think of is that Colorado has been a place that's fascinated me for some time, because I remember seeing you can get on the website from the Center of Disease Control, and the CDC actually publishes these obesity maps throughout for all the states and looks at the prevalence of obesity. And you can actually see it from the 80s, and it's quite telling to see the rise, the cascading rise in the prevalence of obesity since that time. But Colorado has held its ground quite well in terms of it's typically a lot lower prevalence than all the other states in rates of obesity. And the question can be begged to ask, what is the rationale for that? And it may be that maybe it's an outdoorsy type environment and people are active. But one quite interesting novel thought, and this was actually presented by researchers from the University of Texas, they observed, and it's quite well documented now, that there's this relationship between obesity levels and altitude. And in fact, with increasing altitude, typically we see a reduction in weight status. And this intrigues me quite greatly because we know that Colorado certainly has, you go up to the Rockies there, you can get up over 14,000 feet. I think even Denver is like 5,000 feet, and that's sort of, that's base level. And so they've come up with this idea. In fact, in this paper, they actually said they called it ascent to altitude as a weight loss method. What do you think about this, Simon? You like where this is going?
I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued. And my mind's going at 100 miles an hour trying to work out what the mechanism might be.
Yes.
Which, of course, is an important part of this, isn't it? Because, without a mechanism, we may just be looking at an interesting correlation for whatever reason. I don't know, maybe Colorado has a preponderance of fresh fruit and vegetable stores that are very close to where people live. Maybe that explains it. Maybe the density of fresh fruit and vegetable stores also increases with altitude.
Yeah,
but
all of those things.
I'm just wondering. I'm wondering what a mechanism could be that might explain this. The first thing that comes to mind for me is that the higher altitude you live at, the harder you have to work to breathe.
Well, there's a treat.
I don't know. That it doesn't seem like you could burn that many calories just by working a little bit harder to breathe. Even though your experience trail walking might suggest differently.
Yeah. Well, here's where the plot thickens. So now what I'm going to say to you, we like to stay in the house of science. So please, what we talk about today is just a bit speculative, but it's fun to entertain the idea anyway.
Is this like the paint on the outside of the walls of the house of science? Is that where we're going?
That's exactly right. But hey, it might migrate its way indoors one day. So it's worth. I find that some of these sort of quirky studies fun to entertain. So there's some researchers from the Nutrition Obesity Research Center at the University of Alabama. Alabama, that's correct. And what they found is a really interesting observation, and that is that they surveyed and started to do studies on animals across about 8 different species, and they'd actually taken measurements on about 20,000 animals now. And what they have observed is that there seems to be a move towards weight gain, even amongst free-living wild animals. So here's this interesting thought. Now, what's going on there? It's not like these animals have access to the sorts of highly processed foods and, it's not like their food choices have changed that much. They still have to be as active as they are, you would think, to do the things that they need to do. So why on earth would we potentially see weight gain, not just amongst us humans, but even amongst animals as well, animal species? And one thought
that immediately comes to mind is that every time people go out and visit animals, they always feed them their own food, which really annoys me when people feed animals people food. And maybe people are feeding animals unhealthy people food.
That definitely could be an explanation. But
you're going to tell me something different, aren't you?
I'm going to tell you something different. So here's what the researchers thought, is that, one thing that is common between we humans and animals is that we're breathing the same air. And then you start to connect some of these dots. So, for example, there is this recognition that with increasing altitude, you tend to be less weight gain. In fact, so much so that I don't know if you ever have an ambition to climb Everest or go to base camp. I've got some friends who do. They will tell you that when they go up there to altitude, you almost have to start force feeding yourself, because what happens is your appetite starts to change. And the thinking is that you actually have changes in partial pressures of gases. And we're going to talk particularly about CO2 in just a moment, that may actually affect your blood chemistry in quite subtle ways, but that could have an influence on, for example, appetite centers in your brain, and so therefore change your feeding behaviors quite naturally. And so there's this emerging idea that when it comes to, weight control and weight gain in particular, maybe there's something in the air. You see, if you follow the logic here, we know that as you go to higher altitude, the barometric pressure increases. And because of that, the partial contribution of the pressure of all the gases in that air, they start to decrease as well. So the partial pressure of carbon dioxide as you go to altitude decreases. That then affects, potentially appetite regulation in your brain and makes you want to eat less. But what would happen if we went the other direction? Instead of reducing the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, we started to increase the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Would that have the opposite effect instead of...
So can you do this by living under the sea?
Well, you could go down, I assume, but it's really hard to live down there, and food's not that plentiful anyway, certainly not the fast food. But there is another way to do it, and that is, there's actually a couple of ways to do it, and we're almost doing this experiment on ourselves at a global level. And that is, within the air that we breathe, increase the amount of carbon dioxide. And that has definitely occurred. In fact, if we look at, for millennia, as far back as we can see, the partial pressure or the concentration of CO2, carbon dioxide within the atmosphere was less than 300 parts per million. But what we've observed, it snuck over, I think it was about sort of early in the industrial sort of revolution. It's probably around about the 1920s, 1930s. We saw it actually, the CO2 levels get to 300 parts per million. And then in the last sort of 30 to 40 years, we have just seen this radical increase. In fact, you can actually get online and they've got sensors all around the world. You can actually see what it is today. And it's running at about 422 parts per million today, which is
what we would see is rates of obesity pretty closely tracking the increase in carbon dioxide partial pressure.
And you do exactly that. In fact, I've got a nice little graphic where you can actually see the rise in CO2 concentrations within the atmosphere over the past 30 years or so. And they almost mirror the rise in the obesity rates within the United States. So here's this really interesting, thought to throw out there that, if you go to altitude, CO2 decreases, you lose your appetite. But if you come down to a place like sea level, where we have increasing and ever increasing levels of CO2, that it's actually maybe causing us to change our feeding behaviors because it's affecting appetite regulation centers in our brain.
Yeah, wow.
What do you think, Simon?
Well, I think, okay, so I think that there's quite a few things running around inside my mind. The first one is, at the moment, all we're talking about, as far as I can see, is a correlation. So, yes, in the last century, carbon dioxide levels have risen. Yes, obesity has increased. Maybe there's another factor that's common to both of those. So that's a possibility. Probably the other thing that I think is important here is that in all of my experience in living, there is almost never a single causal linkage for anything. Events that happen are always a collection of contributing factors and causal factors. So maybe that's a part of the picture, alongside some of the other things that we've observed as well. I mean, we've all observed the radical change in diet across the 20th century. We've observed different patterns of socialization and social connection. We've observed different patterns of movement, particularly in the industrialized world across the 20th century. So part of me is thinking maybe this is another factor that's that's no pun intended, feeding all of this. But there's a bunch of other things as well.
Yeah, and look, that's definitely a truth. Like, for example, even if it was increasing our appetite, we need access to the food to eat, don't we? So what is interesting, what is interesting is that those researchers from the University of Alabama who had noticed this within animals, is one subset of the animals that observed this weight gain amongst was animals in laboratory experiments.
Lift is supported by the Lift Project, an educational adventure where you learn science-based ways to lift your mood and your life. The Lift Project is lifting lives around the globe, in healthcare settings, workplaces, schools, universities and communities. To find out more, visit theliftproject.global.
Where they were offered food ad libitum, but they've always been offered that. And what seems to be the case is that animals are volunteering to eat more food. They've always had access to it, but over the years, as they sort of map the rates of weight gain amongst them, they're actually seeing this increase. So I find it fascinating. And, once again, I think it's multifactorial, but it always is fun to try and ask the whys and get back to the root cause. And this whole idea of, the atmosphere, the air that we're breathing is definitely changing, and it could be playing a part in this because it's certainly everywhere. We're all exposed to the same atmosphere. So
I've got a couple of questions that I want to ask you here. So the first one is, if the air is a significant contributing factor, why isn't everyone obese? Why aren't all animals obese or overweight? And clearly that's not the case. We're certainly seeing increasing rates, but there's about in Australia, there's about 1/3 or more of the population that still sits within a normal weight range, and that's true in the UK, the US, and so on. So why, if it's the air, why isn't it affecting all of us?
And that's a good question. And, I come back to my original story, is that we know that people are affected differently when they're exposed to altitude. And it's actually quite difficult to predict. It's interesting, altitude sickness, for example, isn't a fitness-related thing. It's just some people have this, it might be a genetic expression or whatever it might be, but some people are more susceptible to altitude sickness than others. So it may be, we definitely know there's huge variation in us sort of biophysically and all the rest of it. So that potentially could be an explanation that some of us are more affected than others. Another really interesting thing is that what's quite well documented is that when people spend time indoors and closed spaces that are not ventilated, you can actually see, like as I said, go outside. You've got about 422 parts per million of carbon dioxide. In indoor spaces, it can be about 2.5 times more than that. So it can be in the order of 1,000 parts per million.
1,000 parts per million.
And so, what that might mean is that if you're spending a lot of your time indoors, and most adults are today, in fact, some studies suggest that the average adult's spending about over 90% of their time indoor spaces. Well, what that could mean is that for those people who are doing that in those sorts of environments, it's driving, it's sort of escalating this effect, if it is an effect, and if it indeed is having an impact.
Yeah. Because if you're spending 90% of your time indoors, it's also likely that you're minimally active.
True.
Unless you happen to be like me. Guess what I've done this week?
What have you done this week apart from going to the ACLM conference?
I've bought some rollerblades. I'm learning to rollerblade. And here's the thing. I'm learning to I've got hard floors here. I'm learning to rollerblade inside the apartment.
Inside?
Yeah,
wow.
yeah. So I'm being as active as I possibly can on rollerblades inside the apartment. And you might think that's a bad idea to learn to rollerblade. I'm very cleverly using behavioural science and behavioural medicine here. So my incentive is that I don't want to break anything in the house. So I'm very, very careful as I learn to rollerblade around the house. Anyhow, all of that is to say, unless you're rollerblading around inside your own house, you're probably minimally active as well.
Absolutely. I think that there is something in that rollerblading analogy for us all. And I don't know why, but for some reason in my mind, I'm seeing you in tight lycra and like an 80s headband, fluorescent orange or pink or something or other. And if that is the case, what I want to say to you, Simon, is that don't deny the public from seeing that site. So do your indoor stuff, but get outdoors.
You're creeping me out now, Darren. You've put cameras inside my place, haven't you?
Well, there you go. There you go. And you know what the worst thing is? That all of the people that are listening to me and just describe that, they cannot unsee it either. So when you do get to bump into Simon next year at ACLM, you're going to be looking him up and down. And yes, we all know.
So what does all this mean for those of us who work in the area of lifestyle medicine? This idea that maybe the air that we're breathing is in fact contributing to not just our health overall, but very specifically the level of adiposity that we have.
So let's go there. But it just brought back to mind when I discovered some of these studies and was sort of piecing the parts together. I shared this with one of my friends, who's anyway. He said to me, "Great," he says. "So I'm not allowed to eat this. I have to move like that, and now you're telling me I can't even breathe that much." So it is. We don't want this to be a downer for people. But look, I think there are a couple of key takeaways from it. And one is that getting outdoors, there's tremendous value to that, because if the CO2 levels, if this is a thing, I keep saying that, I'm using that caveat, but if this is a thing, then spend time outdoors as much as you're able. So try and, that be very conscious of the indoor spaces. If you are in indoor spaces and you have to spend a lot of time there, then I would suggest opening windows. So ventilation is a good thing. So getting that ventilation piece. And the other thing that I think is huge value in this that this points to is that they're getting some plants, actually greening up your indoor spaces, which we know obviously, reduces CO2 levels, emits oxygen instead, and our brains definitely like oxygen. So I think that's for me, a couple of the key takeaways is get outdoors as often as you can. So it speaks to that blue and green spaces, get out there. When you're indoors, open up the windows where able, and then decorate them with plants. Yeah, that's my key takeaways.
I've found the carpet of dead leaves on the floor is not good for rollerblading, but
really,
yeah,
there you go.
But I take your point. Green plants. So from the perspective of lifestyle medicine and importantly from the perspective of things that we can actually do personally, this raises some intriguing questions. So let's start broadly here. In the area of diet, for example, yes, at some level, we can all control what we put in our mouths. We can control the food we eat, the amount of it that we eat, the choices that we make, and so on. But within a context. So if you're living in an area that we would call a food desert, a paucity of fresh fruit, vegetable shops, an overabundance of places that sell ultra-processed food, then those choices that you can make are shaped by some of those factors that aren't immediately within your control. So this is where the picture of lifestyle modification and behavioural change and health does start to get quite complex, and we need to recognise that lifestyle medicine really needs to act at all levels of society. Yes, we need to be focused on clinician education. It's absolutely vital that physicians and all health clinicians understand the pillars, the principles of lifestyle medicine, and can engage their patients and clients in that discussion. It's vital that the people that we work with are able to make healthy choices. But it's also really important that we think systemically, and that we think at a community, a society, a national and even a global level about our health and well-being. And I think it's also important that as practitioners and clinicians in the field, we're prepared to act at that level as well. We're prepared to add our voices to efforts at change at that level, and so become ambassadors for health, not just directly with the people that we work with, but at a much broader level than that as well. Yeah,
those upstream.
But of course, that's one of the things that that's one of the functions that professional associations serve nicely. I think your voice, my voice, standing alone is likely to have little impact. But when we together are parts of professional associations focused on something, as we both are, then collectively that association is able to, I think, leverage a lot more influence over some of these factors.
Yeah.
If we think about the idea of exercise is always exemplary here for me. So we know what the physical activity recommendations are. Moderate intensity exercise, 150 minutes or more a week, or at least moderate intensity exercise, at least 150 minutes a week, and 2 to 3 episodes of resistance training per week as well. But that's kind of in place of the more natural movement that we might have had 200, 500, 1,000 years ago. You know, there were no gyms 1,000. Well, actually, that's not true. There were gyms 1,000 years ago. There were no franchised gyms 1,000 years ago. People worked physically hard. They lifted things, they moved things, they carried things, they walked places, and so on. So there was a lot of natural movement. The exercise prescriptions that we have now are an effort to replicate what we could do if we had a different lifestyle, but don't. And because we're minimally active, we have to make that extra bit effort to do those things to keep us healthy, because we all now work in front of computer screens, and we sit at desks, and we catch trains or buses to work, or we drive cars and so on. We need to make that extra bit of effort to be physically active. So I wonder whether, in relation to the air that we breathe, even though we can't immediately change the composition of it, perhaps we can influence that across time, but we can't immediately change the composition. What we can do, though, is attend to the things that are in fact within our control that might offset that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And to my mind, the key things we can do is get outdoors, open the window, get some plants, and take some deep breaths every now and then.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things where I am right now in the centre of Madrid is about 2,200 feet elevation.
Sure.
And so every time I run, every time I climb up the stairs, I'm just ever so slightly oxygen deprived, ever so slightly. And I'm starting to think that has a positive training effect for me, because I constantly train at this altitude. And then when I go to a place like Florida, which is sea level, when I ran the 5K run at the conference a couple of weeks ago, I don't know, it just seemed a little bit easier. I wonder whether it's to do with that. So, there's some of the things that we could all be thinking about, thinking about the small ways that we can modify what we do to offset some of the things that are outside of our day-to-day control.
Yep. Good plan. But until then, friends, make sure you get outdoors and take some deep breaths. It'll do you well.
And as well as getting outdoors and taking deep breaths, if you like the podcast, make sure you subscribe as well. If you subscribe, you don't have to wait for it to appear on, your social media platform that you might browse from time to time. It will appear effortlessly in your podcast feed, and you won't miss a single episode if you do that. So get out, move naturally, eat great food, hit subscribe.
Well said.
Lift is presented by Simon Matthews and Darren Morton. It's sponsored by the Lift Project and supported by Avondale University. Music provided by Pixabay. If you have a question or a topic you would like to hear more about, send us an email to podcast@theliftproject.global. The Lift Project. Lift your mood, lift your life.